All right. Hi, everybody. We are going to get this thing started. Let's see. All right. I am Sarah Milstein, and I am joined today by Mercedes Kraus. We had a little uniform that we agreed on beforehand so that you'd have a hard time telling us apart. All right, no, actually, it's not going to matter that much because it's mostly you're going to be seeing slides. I have a presentation I'm going to share. And the way this is going to work today is I'm going to do the presentation. Mercedes is going to be monitoring the chat, and there's chat in the YouTube window over on the side. And that's where you can ask questions. It's a little weird because there's a delay of about 15 seconds between what I'm saying and what you see. So the chat won't be completely immediate, but we'll work with it. We've done stuff like this before and it's been okay. And I would encourage everybody to ask as many questions as you want, either during the presentation or afterwards. We'll have a lot of time for Q&A. All right, so let's get this thing started with the actual presentation. All right, so speaking at conferences, getting invited to speak at conferences. All right, so first of all, why are we doing this? Why have this presentation at all? Well, I have hosted a lot of conferences, dozens of them, and I've spoken at dozens of them. And I want to demystify the process for you of getting chosen as a speaker, and I bring the perspective from both sides of picking speakers, finding them and picking them, and applying to speak or being asked, invited out of the blue. So I just want to demystify for everybody because there's a really very specific set of processes by which conferences find speakers. All right, so a couple of things you need to know before we get started here. The first is that there are a lot of good reasons to speak at a conference. You might want to do it to raise your profile. You might have ideas that you want to spread. You might have some ideas you're working on in writing or in business, and you want to see how people respond to them. You might want to get paid, and we'll talk more a little later about how realistic that is and whether that's a good motivator. And it also could be that you do it for fun. I speak at a lot of conferences just because I like doing it at this point. All right. Also, you should know that you can learn to be a good speaker. Actually, you can learn to be a great speaker. Very, very few people start out naturally as great speakers. There's sort of a myth of like the great presenter. This is a total myth because there's tons of resources available for everything, every aspect of speaking, for the, overcoming fear, for having great physical presence, for designing slides, for creating a talk that has a lot of resonance. All of the aspects of speaking are things that you can learn. And I have to tell you, when I first started, I didn't know any of them and just studied a lot. And there's online resources, there's classes, there's a lot of ways you can go, and we can talk a little bit more about that at the end. But you don't need to be a great speaker to get on the speaking circuit. All right. Another thing that we're going to assume today is that solo speaking is better than being on a panel. There's kind of a myth that when you want to start speaking, you first get on panels. And it's not crazy. I wouldn't discourage you from pursuing panels, but what we're talking about today is solo speaking. And there's a number of reasons. So panels, first of all, you don't usually control what's going on stage. The moderator does. Even if you're the moderator, there's other people involved. You have much less control. You don't get the best chance to shine because there's lots of other people speaking, and sometimes the ideas that you have that are most important don't come up at all. Nearly always, you're sitting down, and it's hard to have a lot of presence. And also, fewer and fewer conferences are looking for panels these days. Increasingly, conferences look for solo speakers. And the TED model has become very popular. Talks that are anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes are most common these days. So sometimes you're at a conference where panels are the norm. They're the norm at South by, and a handful of industries have mostly panels. And some conferences have much longer speaking slots. But most of the time, they're pretty short, and most conferences are looking for solo speakers. So that's primarily what we're talking about today. And then finally, I want to note that bias is sometimes a factor in how conferences choose speakers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. It's not what this talk is about, although we can discuss it at the end if y'all want. But it would be ridiculous if I didn't note that people who look like me create conferences that look like this all the time. This is a conference that was in the tech sector. And as you can see here, about 30 speakers, 1 Black person, 4 or 5 women out of the whole batch. And I happen to know the organizers of this, and they are white women my age. So it's not like people like me don't create conferences that don't look like this. We have to acknowledge that. But again, that's not what we're talking about today primarily. All right, so with those things in mind, there are a couple things you need to know to get chosen to speak at conferences. All right, so 2 primary things: how to think like a conference host, and how conferences find speakers. Okay, so once you've got those things down, you're going to know what to ask for as a speaker. Like once you're picked, how do you prep? And also that, like, what are the actual things that you can do to be ready? All right, so those are the things we're going to talk about today, all 4 of them. And we're going to start with how to think like a conference host. So there are 2 parts of this, 2 really key things to thinking like a conference host. The first one is knowing the conference angle. And the second is knowing the audience. These are the things that hosts really care about. All right, so knowing the conference angle, this is really a question of what is the conference really about? So here's an example. I run the Lean Startup Conference. Now, Lean Startup, capital L, capital S, is a set of methodologies that my co-host, a guy named Eric Ries, has written about extensively. He has a best-selling book and a very popular blog. And we cover at the conference, very specifically, Lean Startup approaches to business problems. Now, we draw about 1,500 entrepreneurs, but we're not a general entrepreneurship or general startup conference. We have a lot of tech sector speakers, but we're not a tech conference. And despite the word lean in the title, we're not about bootstrapping your business or running it on the cheap. We are about applying lean startup ideas to business problems. It's really pretty narrow. That angle is important to us. We don't consider talks that don't fit under that angle. Now, by way, here's a sort of a counter example of where you could go a little bit wrong on this. So, you know, you really have to understand what's relevant for a host. A while back, a colleague of mine who runs a lot of technical conferences got an email from somebody who wanted to give a talk about a social aspect of Twitter. Now, he runs technical conferences. Twitter is a technical tool, but her talk wasn't technical. Most of his conferences, people have code up on the screens. It's really about, they're for developers. And she didn't define the idea beyond a 2-word title that didn't reveal very much. And she didn't say which of his several conferences, all of which have different angles, she thought her talk would be a fit for. If you are proposing a talk idea, you have to know all of those things. You have to be very specific. You have to understand how your talk fits the conference angle. Just saying, you do technical, I'm in the realm of technical, not close enough. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about this. But one important thing to think about is the difference between telling and teaching. Conferences often focus on one or the other. So telling is kind of the big ideas, thinking about the future, big concept. Teaching is usually how-to talks, very nitty-gritty, how do I do this? Some conferences do both. A common hybrid is you have main stage talks that are more the telling, big picture stuff, and breakouts that are how-tos. But some conferences are very much one or the other. TED, for example, is almost exclusively about telling. And I mean, it's the tagline is ideas that matter, or ideas worth spreading, sorry. And, you know, if you think about it, lots of nonprofit directors speak at TED because, you know, they have this whole thing about changing the world. That's really what they care about. And lots of nonprofit directors attend TED. But you would not have a talk at TED about how to get 501c3 status. That how-to stuff is not really what TED is about. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to that. Amy Cuddy's very popular talk about how to present yourself with more of an authoritative stance is a little bit how-to. Yeah, we're doing hands on hips right now.
Power pose.
Power pose. But it's not really, it's about a big idea. And for the most part, TED Talks are not about how-to. So that's something you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about conference angles. Which is really the focus of the conference and which is the kind of talk that you're ready to give. Often the how-to talks are things that you, in a career, you may actually be able to do your how-to talk before you have big idea talks. So think about those. So When you are approaching a conference, your talk really has to fit the angle. And I wanted to just share an exercise. Now, when I do this talk live, exercises are fun to do. Because of the delay in the webcast, this isn't going to be fun exercise-wise, but I wanted to include these so you could go back and take a look and do these later. And sometimes they're fun to do with another person. So when we ask, what is it really about? If you spend a little time, spend 10 minutes thinking about the angle of a conference you've attended recently. And one key difference between that, the content of that conference, and TED. And TED's an easy one because we've all seen TED Talks, so you have an idea of what TED is aiming for. So I just want to, as a little example of that, I want to ask Mercedes, has worked on the ONA conference, the Online News Association. And I want to ask if you could just tell us what was the angle for the ONA that you worked on, which was 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the angle was, it was for digital journalists and for people at basically the forefront of digital journalism and technology, and people generally working in legacy organizations. Those are the kind of people that can generally afford to go to larger conferences. And so those were people who were in newsrooms trying to kind of shake things up. And wanting to know about a bunch of different sectors and how they're influencing journalism. Very much like on the cusp of a specific place, not really like newsroom developers or anybody super technical, though some of those people are there, but really about how to create integrated newsrooms and embrace new technologies and, think beyond what journalism has been doing.
So a lot of how-to.
Yeah, there are definitely some big ideas, though. It was really a mix. The keynotes and the super popular ones tended to be the ideas. Mm-hmm. And then there were hordes of workshops and smaller talks that was a bit more how-to, like how to build an audience or what social is like in this thing, or, how to integrate strange hardware, data gathering things into your data journalism team, or, stuff like that.
Thanks. So that's a good example where there's hybrid. And as you said, the main stage talks wind up being more of the big picture, and then the breakouts, which a subset of people can go to, are more how-to. Mm-hmm. So you can get a bunch of designers in a room, and all of the people who are primarily writers don't need to attend that session. So the breakouts can work a little differently. All right, so when you're interested in a conference, you need to learn the angle, and it's pretty easy to educate yourself. Study the conference website. Often the conference will tell you pretty narrowly what it's about. Watching previous talks is a great way to find out what the angle of the conference is, and almost all conferences now post their video of their talks online. And of course, if you can, attending the conference is always a good way to really understand the conference angle. And just part of it is paying attention, knowing that you have to think beyond, is this just a business conference? Is this just a tech conference? Very specifically, what is this conference about? So that's the angle aspect of conferences, and it's vitally important to hosts because it's what differentiates one conference from another. But also knowing the audience is really important. So Mercedes just talked about the fact that ONA was primarily not for developers, even though there was a technical angle to it. There may have been a few developers who showed up, but that wasn't who they were targeting. So it wasn't like people were giving talks with code samples on the screen. That's not, even though it's the Online News Association. Another example is Web 2.0 Expo, which I used to run. It was a big conference. It drew about 10,000 people. So you would think anything web related would fit. But it was really a show for designers, developers, and business people who were trying to figure out how the web was creating opportunities for their businesses. We regularly heard from people who wanted to speak about lawyering 2.0 or accounting 2.0, things that were about the future of their business. But it wasn't relevant to us because we didn't have accountants and lawyers in our audience. That was not who we were drawing. So you have to be very conscious about the audience. Now, another example to think about here is South by. I know a lot of folks here have attended South by Southwest. So one thing to think about is South by it has a technical angle, right? But is South by a must attend for sysadmins? Do you have to go if you're in DevOps? It's not for everybody who's technical. If you're a sysadmin, you might enjoy going, but they are not primarily trying to draw those people. It's not about back-end technologies, even though it's a technical conference. So again, on the exercise front, I would encourage you to spend a little time thinking about who attends TED or a conference you've attended in the past years. If you've never been to TED, you could just take a guess based on the talks. And the more specific you can be about who attends and any trends that you've noticed, the better. And just sort of train yourself to think that way a little bit. Now, again, when you're looking at a conference where you're interested in speaking, there's a couple of good ways to educate yourself. You can learn about the angle and the audience, usually from the conference website and from previous talks. So you want to spend some time on the conference site or attending the conference if you can. You can also ask around about the audience. People who have attended may have a good sense of it, and often people will be able to tell you who attended. They may not have been thinking about the angle, but they'll know who they met. So they'll be able to give you trends. And you can also ask the host. So you can write to them and say who attends. But if you're going to do that, you want to demonstrate that you have done your research. So instead of just saying, who do you think is the audience for this, you would write to them and say, I'm interested in potentially speaking at your conference in the future, and I'm trying to understand the audience. And looking at your website, it seems that you attract both corporate employees and entrepreneurs. Do you think of one as the primary attendee? You want to show them that you've done your homework. Now, you will notice here that I didn't suggest that you should ask the hosts about the conference angle. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The main one is that it's very hard to ask about the conference angle without trying to pitch your own talk and say, do you think my talk is a fit for your conference? Hosts do not like getting those emails. So do your research about the angle on your own from their existing materials that are out there, but you could probably slip in a question about audience if you were trying to understand them a little bit better. All right, so we've hit our first point here, how to think like a conference host. I didn't have a check mark that I could find, so we're using a little lightning rod instead. So we're just rolling with that. All right, so how do conferences find speakers? This is obviously sort of a key part of this talk. And there are two primary ways. One is they invite people that they know or they know of. And two is they hold an open call for speakers and you can apply. So let's talk about how this works. And by the way, a lot of conferences do both. All right, so they invite people they know or they know of. Now, people they know include friends and coworkers, people who are directly in their network. People they know of include folks who are prominent or whose writing or speaking they like. So people who are prominent could be, Bill Clinton, could be Shonda Rhimes. People whose writing they like could be Dan Ariely or Elizabeth Gilbert or any number of folks who are on a speaking circuit, but they're invited primarily because they're known for their writing. And the way the conferences come up with those people to invite is they sit down and brainstorm. And sometimes it's staff members who just get together and say, okay, what are our themes for this year? Who do we know or who do we want to know that we're going to invite? Sometimes there's a program committee that participates or some other folks who get involved. But generally, it's a brainstorm. So, you can mimic that brainstorm and sort of get in the mindset by doing a little brainstorm on who you'd like to see at TED and why. So, for example, is your colleague who's taught a lot of people how to install WordPress templates and is a genius at it a good choice for TED? Is Michelle Alexander, who has written The New Jim Crow, a book about the injustice in our so-called criminal justice system, a good candidate? Think about people you would like to see and why, and some people that you'd like as speakers who might not be a good fit for TED. Get yourself thinking like a host. All right, so of course, to get invited in this process, if you know conference hosts, you want to let them know what you can speak about, but also you want to get known. So there's a few ways that people typically do this. The most common way is you write. And if you're a writer, you want to write not only on your own blog, you want to publish in places where the conference hosts might be reading. So if you want to speak at business conferences, you want to publish pieces on HBR, on Quartz, on other places that take, or Forbes, that take blog posts or freelance submissions. If you want to speak at food conferences, you want to think about writing for magazines like Bon Appetit, websites like Food 52. There's lots of different outlets, of course, for any kind of content, and you want to think about what's a good match for the kind of conferences where you want to speak. Now, writing isn't the only way to get found. In different communities, tweeting, podcasting, Instagramming, YouTubing are all more appropriate. It really sort of depends. Like if you work in a primarily visual medium, something like Instagram may be a place where conference hosts would be looking for other experts. It really depends on the kind of the community that you're in, which tools they use. Think about that. And also, of course, if you are Shonda Rhimes, you don't need to tweet or podcast or write anywhere. People know you for the work you're doing. But I am assuming in this case that if you're Shonda Rhimes, you're not on this webcast because you are being invited by everybody in the world. And it's for those of us who aren't yet as well known for something that we've done. We have not yet been elected president, that we need a little help figuring out the other channels. So think about, where your community is. And it doesn't mean you have to be like super active in those channels. Sometimes that's helpful. A lot of times it's just being occasionally active, but being very thoughtful and contributing something that's very high quality for people. All right. You also want to make yourself accessible to conference hosts, and that means on your own site. You want to post the topics that you can speak about. You want to have video of yourself speaking if you have it. So as soon as you get video, you want to post it. And you want your email address, so it's easy for them to find you. As a conference host, it's a nightmare when you learn about somebody you want to invite and there's no way to reach them easily. I will note too that when you post video of yourself, short is fine. It's much better if it's a solo speaking engagement rather than video of you as a panelist. You can have multiple videos, of course. And it doesn't really matter what the topic is. I have 2 videos linked on my website. They're both Ignite talks. They're 5-minute talks. One of them is about my phobia of snakes, and one of them is about how to cook with kale, which was from back in the day before kale was ubiquitous. And conference hosts tell me all the time that they watched them and enjoyed them. And even though they are not asking me to speak about phobias or kale, the video showed them that I was a good speaker. All right, so that's about getting known, right, and being invited. The other way that you can get onto a conference roster is by applying to speak. So choice B is that the conference has a CFP, which is short for call for proposals. Sometimes that's short for call for participation. It could also be called an RFP, a request for proposals. It could just be called an application. It's called a lot of things, most commonly a CFP. And basically, it's just an application. There's usually a form you fill out. And the heart of it is a paragraph where you talk about, where you write out the talk you want to give, or just describe it in a paragraph. Occasionally, conferences, rather than have you describe the talk, ask you to create a video, a 2 or 3 minute video explaining it. Our conference does that. Either way, that's the heart of the application generally. And so when you I'll talk a little more about that, how to describe a talk in a minute. But I want to note, when you find a conference where you want to speak, look on their website if they have a CFP. If you can't find it, ask them on Twitter. Get on their mailing list, follow them on Twitter, figure out what the deadlines are for their CFP and put it in your calendar and prepare for that. And lots of conferences, really, the only way that you can get on their roster is to apply through the CFP, and they might only hold it once a year. And it might be months and months and months before the conference. Ours is usually at least 6 months and often 9 months before the conference. So you really want to start keeping track in your calendar of when conferences that you're interested open that up. And usually it's also only open for a limited time, sometimes a couple weeks, sometimes a month or more, but it's not endless. All right, so once you've found the CFP and you want to apply, you really want to think about this like you're pitching your talk idea and you want to take it seriously. If you're already a writer and you pitch ideas to editors for stories, it's sort of similar. You want to have a very concise, very specific description of the expertise that you have to share or the story that you have to share. Right? And there's a few things to think about in the application process. So first of all, read the directions. Now, this seems like a little obvious, but I will say you don't want to give conferences a reason to cut you out or disqualify you just because you haven't followed the directions. And usually the directions are there for a real reason and they care. So read the directions and follow them. And the directions often have good info in them, sometimes about the angle of the conference or the audience. So it can really help you out to just invest the time in whatever directions they've written. Before you fill out the application, you want to know the conference angle and the audience. So do that research that we talked about and write down some of those things so it's really clear in your mind who you think the angle and the audience are. Now, you have to know your own angle. So this can go a couple of different ways. And again, this is something you want to write out. When we talk about your angle, this is usually that part where you're describing your talk, the talk that you want to give. And you can think about that a couple of different ways. Typically, it's either the experience that you have that's relevant to their audience or advice that you have for their audience. You don't have to worry if you're not the world's expert in whatever the topic is. They already know those people. Conferences know the experts on whatever the topic is. You just need to have some expertise or advice that's relevant. And you don't want to worry when you are filling out the form that you're giving away your great idea. Conferences, there's no history of conferences taking somebody's good idea and turning it into a talk somewhere else. You really want to be specific with them. It's possible, of course, two people pitch very similar ideas. They might pick yours over somebody else's over yours, but no one's stealing your ideas. And you really can only give conferences reasons to take you if you're more specific about what you're going to share. I would suggest one other thing here, which is being very wary of jargon when you are describing your talk. Prospective speakers often like to use a lot of jargon to demonstrate that you're part of the world, that you can talk the talk. Conference hosts almost always find it either off-putting or a demonstration that you don't really know what you're talking about. So in our world, in the lean startup world, for example, people like to talk a lot about pivots and MVPs. That's part of the jargon of the community. The more people use those phrases in an application, the less it seems like they know what they're talking about. So, and that's been true for every conference I've ever hosted. Be very careful with your use of jargon. At the same time, you need to be concise, so finding ways to embody those ideas can sometimes be a little tricky, and that's why you want to spend some time writing it down before you get to the application. Get this all written out for yourself, and then do a cut and paste. Do know that most conferences, the vast majority of conferences, reject sales pitches out of hand. That means pitches for your product or your company. Most people just don't want to sit through a live ad, right? So conferences aren't going to take your ad. So for example, you can't typically expect to get a talk picked if it's about how your dating app has transformed the dating landscape. But you could have 5 lessons about how your data analysis has transformed your ability to connect with your customers. You could have a talk, if you're OkCupid, you can talk about how blogging about your data has changed the way people use your app. But you don't want to be talking about how great your app is per se, how great your product or your company is. You can talk about lessons from your company that other companies could apply and could find interesting. And then finally, no PR people. Now this one is tricky because a lot of folks employ PR people in order to go and find conferences that you might be a fit for and apply to them. But hosts hate being pitched by PR people because usually PR people use a kind of a spray and pray approach, and we get a lot of pitches and applications that are in the neighborhood but not really relevant for the angle, and they feel they don't feel very specific. So if you have a PR person who's looking for conferences for you, you could even have them draft a talk, but you always want to rewrite it in your own voice, and you want to submit with your own email address. And you don't want this thing that PR companies like to do to be crafty and say it's Outcast PR. Instead of putting the PR person's for the email address, instead of putting PR person's name at Outcast PR, they'll put, Yuri Meyer at Outcast PR. We know that it's going to the PR people. So use your own email address. It's important to the conference host that they can reach you directly. Now, one thing I will say is that your PR people can sometimes do outreach to a conference to ask about angles and audience. And if they do that, it's great if they don't identify that they're affiliated with you. They just say, I have some clients who might be interested, and I want to know more about X and Y, and that can be a way to use PR people to your advantage if you have them. All right, so another exercise to think about is what's the pitch that you would create for South by, and not as a panel, but as a solo speaker. What you want to think about, again, is what experience you have that's relevant to other attendees, or what advice you have for attendees. And if you've spoken at South by, that's great. You can think about another conference for an exercise, but you could also think about what are other angles that, now that you know the conference better, that might be relevant. All right, so this is sort of a bonus on getting into conferences, which is use your network. And by which I mean you can have a mutual friend or coworker recommend you to the conference host. If you know somebody who knows the conference host, you can ask for a recommendation. This is not my favorite way of getting in, because it's not really fair. It means the conferences are replicating their own networks in order to build their conference rosters. So we try to avoid doing this, taking recommendations, but it's pretty standard. So it wouldn't really be right for me not to mention this. If you have a connection, you would use it in the same way that you would if you were applying for a job. So there's a couple things you might do. You might ask an intermediary to just give a heads up that you've applied. If there's an open CFP, that's probably what you want to do. You apply, and then you ask them to just let the conference organizers know, your mutual person, let them know, ask them to put in a good word. It could be that you want the conference organizers to get on like an informational call with you, and in which you're going to learn more about what they're looking for so that you can craft a better application. Possibly, if everybody's really tight in this group, you might be able to request a call to brainstorm ideas. That's not out of the question. But if it's pretty loose connection, pretty cold, if you are not really pretty clear on the conference angle and how great you would be for this event, that's unlikely to fly. All right, so we've lightning bolt hit our first 2 points. So let's say you have gone through the application process for a conference, you have been picked. What do you ask for as a speaker? All right, so a couple of things. The first one, the thing that everybody's always kind of most interested in is, can you get paid? Now let me make this pretty clear, as clear as I possibly can. Most conferences don't pay. And they don't pay because they don't have the money to pay. Running conferences, they're very tight margins. At our 1,500 person conference, we spent a lot of time this year. And by the way, it's not just that we draw 1,500 attendees. Our tickets range from $200 to almost $4,000, right? They're pretty expensive. We still do not have the budget to pay speakers. And we did a lot of work to try to be able to pay speakers. And we tried to find sponsorship for it. But the problem is conferences are actually quite expensive to run. And if you are going to pay your conference staff fairly, it's very hard to pay the speakers as well. And most conference staff are women. So this is a tough thing. Some conferences do pay. And it is always worth asking to be paid. It is absolutely, totally legit not to take a speaking gig that doesn't pay, because it's a ton of work to speak at a conference. It's also completely legit to take one that does pay. Speaking can lead to consulting and writing and other gigs, other speaking gigs that might pay. There's lots of reasons to do it for reasons other than money. And it is also 100% legit to ask for money, and if they say no, to take it anyway, or to turn it down if they say no. And the way you do it typically is after you've been accepted, you tell them that your fee is typically X, or you ask them, what do you pay speakers? There's a couple of ways that you can go on asking for money. Nobody has ever, from any conference, been turned away once they were picked, if they then asked to be paid. Once you've asked and they've told you yes or no, then it's your choice whether you continue down the path with them. So don't shy away from asking, but do have very low expectations. One thing you can typically get covered is your travel. So rather than having them pay you directly, some conferences will do both, will pay travel and speaker fees, but a lot of conferences can pay for airfare, ground transportation, hotel, all or some of those. And it's totally legit, again, to go speak at a conference because you want to travel somewhere. My partner, I was invited to speak at a conference in Phoenix a few years ago, and I didn't particularly have any interest in Phoenix or the conference, except that my partner and I had been wanting to try a pizza place in Phoenix for a few years. And so, yeah, Pizzeria Bianca. So I accepted the speaking gig because they would cover my travel. We paid for my partner to fly as well. He stayed with me, of course. And then, I gave the talk, which really was actually turned out to be a pretty fun talk. And then got to go to the pizza place. So we almost missed our flight on the way home because we were eating pizza, but that's a whole different problem. Anyway, it's completely reasonable to go places as a speaker and extend it into a trip. You should have the conference registration covered. This should be automatic. There are a very small number of conferences where the speakers pay, but mostly you want to avoid the pay-to-play thing. You don't want to pay your registration because it then gives the appearance that you are trying to advertise something and that you're not as sort of trustworthy a source. So in general, conferences will cover your registration. You should always confirm that. And if they require that speakers pay, be wary. I know there are conferences that do it, that people find it to be reasonable, but I typically take that as a sign that the conference is not very well run or has possibly some ethical problems. You do want to ask to be videotaped. You want video of yourself as a speaker. And over time, you'll get better and better video of yourself, but ask them if they are taping and if you can get a copy afterward, or if it's going to be posted on YouTube or somewhere where you can pull it down. If they are not videotaping, you can ask if they can provide a volunteer to tape on your phone, or if you can bring a friend or colleague to tape in the room. And then you want to make sure also that that person can sit in the front row or somewhere where they can reasonably record you with a phone. And it's perfectly fine to have your early video of yourself be taped from a phone. If you can get a tripod to make it steadier, that's great. If you can't, it's okay. Conference hosts who look for videotape of you will not care about the quality of the video. Now, I said you could have a friend sometimes tape you. So another thing to ask for a conference is a +1, whether it's for taping purposes or not, but you can often bring a guest, free registration. So that could be a friend, partner, coworker, whatever. But that's something you can ask for. And most conferences have a policy on that. And then you want to also ask for information about who they think the audience is. Make sure you understand the length of the talk, any AV details. They'll usually share all that with you in a series of emails before the conference. But some conferences, especially newer and smaller conferences, don't think to do that stuff. And you want to make sure you're on top of those things. The fewer surprises you have when you show up, the better. All right, so that's what to ask for as a speaker. Let's talk about how to prepare to speak. This is really, there's one key thing that you have to do to prepare, and that is practice. And when I say practice, I mean out loud with a timer, many times, like enough times that your dog could give the talk back to you, in front of people who will give you feedback. Ideally, most talks get better when you get feedback, and that might be in front of people over Skype. You can do it virtually, that works just fine, but you want to do it in front of a few people. And then you want to practice some more. So practice, I mean, it could be that you practice a talk 20 times beforehand. And the point isn't really to memorize it, although you will at some point start to really just know the content. The point is, because when you don't practice, a weird thing happens. When you don't practice, you seem nervous and awkward and not at all spontaneous. You seem really stilted. When you practice a lot, you have a chance to inject a lot of personality into the talk, and you seem very relaxed. You've got muscle memory that lets you seem completely spontaneous. And in fact, you can be a little more spontaneous because when you're that relaxed, you can get a better sense of the audience and the feedback you're getting from them. So I can't say enough how important practice is, and that you should probably bake it into your calendar at a much higher level than you could ever imagine. And then finally, you can do a ton, as I said at the very beginning, to prepare in every possible way, reading, taking classes, getting a coach, you can get that for everything from slide design to physical presence to the content of a talk. There's tons of resources available online and in person for helping you become a better speaker. And it is worth over time investing a little bit in that. And you can build those skills over a number of years. So I think we have lightning bolts on all of our points. So I want to open this up to Q&A. And I'm going to take us off the slides and have us in person. So let's see here. Okay, so this is bearing in mind that we've got a little bit of a delay. So if you're asking questions, we'll have the 15-second delay, but I think we'll roll with that.
Yeah, we had one to start with from Lauren Gilchrist, actually, who says hello.
Yeah, Lauren was a speaker at our last conference.
So she said, can you talk a little bit about how to break into TED, being that there are specific angles and no CFP?
Yeah.
And that might be something to note, that there are like 20 million different kinds of TED now, so that
yeah,
might be something.
Yeah. So TED is a little bit unusual. It's not the only conference that does this, but it's a little unusual in that you're right, they don't have a CFP, and mostly you have to be Shonda Rhimes to get invited. But they have created the TEDx series as a part of their pipeline process. So the TEDx events are usually locally run events where TED gives guidelines. They have published guidelines for how to run them. And they do review the videos from TEDx events as part of their process in looking for new speakers. So I'm pretty sure that Brene Brown's original talk was a TEDx talk, and then she was invited to the main TED stage after that. But they have a number of examples, and I think every year they draw a handful of speakers from the TEDx community, and TEDx conferences often do have a CFP, have some way to apply. And if they don't, there's two things. One, they're usually very local. So you may know the organizers and reach out to them and find out, what kinds of talks they're looking for and figure out how you can be a fit. Or you could run one. There is information on the TED site about how to organize a TED talk. So that's how I would start thinking about that, is really thinking about the TEDx ecosystem as a way in. Other questions?
Well, I have a question about, if you've never spoken before and you've maybe written some and basically you don't have a lot to go on. How do you kind of convince people, right, that you're going to be able to speak well? If I've written and have some domain knowledge and have a sense of what I would want to say and feel like I could come up with a good application, how do I sell somebody that I'm a competent speaker?
Yeah. Right.
Especially if I haven't done that, obviously, in any way before.
Right. Okay, that's a great question. And I will note here, so Mercedes worked on Lean Startup with us this last year and is, in fact, one of the rare people who's a natural on stage and good at all these things. But you may be a good example in that the stuff you did at Lean Startup would not, you wound up being a moderator for a couple of things. Right. And if you wanted to be shown as a speaker, there's a few ways to think about that. So one is, if you've never spoken before and you want to get on the speaking circuit, you want to look for opportunities where the bar is a little lower. So if there is a local Ignite, which is short 5-minute talks, which are hard to do but produce good results. If there is a local TEDx where they take new speakers, apply to those. Try to become part of those, or create your own. You can host your own event and tape the talks and post those. And what I said before about posting on your own site the things that you can speak about, that's really key. Is you can do that before you've ever had a single speaking gig. Is post topics that you would be a good speaker on. So if you, for example, have particular expertise around naturally occurring cultural disasters, right? And so design conferences, urban planning conferences, architecture conferences might be interested in that. You can post about that, and you can show, of course, you've written, but you might want to have a list of talks that you could give. And that just gives hosts a little sense that you can speak. But also, I would say, in that whole idea of a call for proposals, very few conferences make it a requirement that you've spoken somewhere else first. So if you're a brand new speaker, you can do some things that get you out there. You can look for low bar things like Ignite. You can create your own events. You can put things on your page, but you can apply to any conference. If you've got a good idea, that's a good fit for them, and you've done your homework and you really are a good fit and you've got some expertise that's relevant, the fact that you haven't spoken before shouldn't be a barrier. And there's two possible ways that can play out. One, the conference, like Lean Startup, might provide training for speakers. There are a handful of conferences that do. But also you can obtain training, right? So you can pay for it. If you get picked as a speaker and you're not confident, you can pay for it. You can work with other friends who are speakers. There's lots of things and that could be free. There's lots of things that you can do to get yourself ready as a speaker. The main thing is having the ideas that are a fit for the conference.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel a little bit more at ease. I was like, do I need to like interview somebody and post it on YouTube? And
you can do that.
That would be cool, right, but maybe not necessary.
Yeah, I mean that, and what I would say about that is that you're right. That could be cool. And if YouTube is a place that your hosts are hanging out, and there's some kind of content like where a YouTube video would be really relevant, sure, no reason not to do that. But it's probably not the main thing that they need to see. What they really need to see is that you understand the angle of the conference, and you've got a talk that's going to fit.
Right. Okay. Cool. Amy Shropshire had a question. She said, any advice in pitching your employer and letting you talk about something that's related to the company? For example, my company ran a successful Kickstarter and I get asked about it, but the company is hesitant to talk about it.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So there's a few things, and that this is true whether you work for a very small company or a very big company. We had a speaker from a very large, well-known company who, after we accepted a talk from him last year, went through the ringer with his PR group and almost wasn't able to speak. And we had one speaker who, the head of another giant company that you all have heard of, the actual like CEO of the company said this pretty junior person could speak, and then the PR group squashed it and we weren't able to have him as a speaker. So it's an issue at big companies, and it's an issue at little companies that feel like their reputations are very vulnerable. There's a few ways around it. One is sometimes companies will get more flexible if you are able to talk about the lessons that you have without sharing specific numbers. So we had a talk, for example, from a guy who was a former Etsy employee, and so he wasn't still beholden to them. But his agreement with them when he left was that he would be able to speak if when he talked about what he'd learned there, he used fake numbers and he specified that. So sometimes using either fake numbers or no numbers without sharing data that might be revealing, that can be useful. A lot of times, if you can help the company understand how attendees of the conference may be good recruits and future staff, employees, the argument that you can make your company look smart and look like an attractive place to apply to work can sometimes help companies recognize the value for them in getting an idea out there, getting some of your company experience out there. I would say too that there's of course a little bit of a line between asking for forgiveness and asking for permission, but sometimes companies are more likely to say yes if you've applied and get accepted or get into a conversation with the host than if you say, well, I want to apply. Because the host may be able, once you're in conversation with them, they may be able to give you a little bit of ammunition to use to say, here's who our audience is, here's the speakers we've had in the past. That social proof can also be useful. You can go to your employer and say, here's the other companies that have spoken in the past that are like ours. And sometimes the hosts can also give you lists of companies that attend. They won't tell you people's names, but they'll tell you what are the companies that have attended in the past. And sometimes you can find that on a conference website. So going to your employer and saying, look, our competitors are there. People like us are there. We should be there too. That can help as well. I hope all of that's helpful, Amy. I know that's a tough one. And sometimes it takes a little persistence.
So I know this, we've talked about this a lot at Lean Startup. I have a general question a little bit more about how to learn to prepare to speak. That's not totally on topic. I think there has been some discussion about that in the past. But one of the questions that I think is compelling and that kind of speaks to the angle question is one that we got from Tiffany, who was asking about the best way to integrate social media. I mean, I've seen people like schedule tweets to live tweet their own talks or anything like that. Is there I don't know, is there anything interesting or surprising that you've heard about that, or any suggestions you have about maybe pitching with that, or good resources to find out more about how to do that well?
Yeah, right. So a couple things I would say about that. First of all, if you're a brand new speaker, you want to reduce the number of things you're doing on stage. So for the most part, you don't want to worry about social media during your talk. But as you get more comfortable as a speaker, it's a good thing to think about, especially if it's a conference that's very connected and that uses Twitter, for example, very heavily, or any other form of social media. I mean, I feel like by the time this thing gets posted to YouTube, people are going to be using Snapchat as like a primary conference tool. But at any rate, so there are a couple of smart things I've seen people do. You can pre-schedule tweets. That can go horribly wrong. So I would make sure if you do that, that you know how to get back into Buffer or whatever it is you're using, so you can turn it off if something goes wrong, and you have the ability to do that from stage. But you can also do some stuff on stage that can be interesting. So when I give this talk that I just gave you guys, when I do it live, I do those exercises, and we usually take anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute per exercise. And while people are doing their own thinking or talking to each other about like what's the angle for TED, I check Twitter to see what they're saying about the talk, so I can make adjustments or answer questions that have come up during Twitter. So one of the reasons I build exercises into my talks, it's more interesting for people and you learn more, but it also gives me a little bit of a way to feel like what's going on in the room. So that's one way to do it. Often, I mean, bring a friend, right? So, right, like we didn't use Twitter in this case, but Mercedes is really the person who's monitoring the social media channel in this case, and we wanted to have Q&A as part of it, and there was not a good way to do that live with an unknown number of attendees on the video, so we're using YouTube chat. You know, bringing a friend is not a crazy idea, and you can do sometimes, depending on the conference, if there is time for Q&A, and if people are asking questions by Twitter, you might have somebody who pulls out the most interesting questions and texts them to you or something like that, and you can have your phone on the lectern or something along those lines. So there's ways to think about it for sure, but a lot of times what the conference cares about is that you tweet beforehand that you're going to be speaking with a link to the conference, and that you tweet your video, links of your video afterwards, because they want to get known. So, you know, helping the conference promote the conference is usually something that the hosts care about quite a lot.
Perfect segue into our next question. Back to Lauren. She was asking about best practices for sharing slides or your talk afterward. She said she has seen people turn their talks into lengthy blog posts, and she feels like that's overkill. So are there, some best practices or things you might recommend?
Yeah, definitely. So on that note, did you share the link for the slides for this talk?
Not yet, but I am about to.
So they're up on SlideShare, and Mercedes will put them in the chat. So first of all, at this point, most conferences, certainly most organized conferences, like to have your slides to put up on their site or on their SlideShare account or wherever. So, and sometimes they'll let you share a deck that's different from the deck you used in person, because the deck you used in person may not have enough information to be really valuable to people if it's posted without the context of your talk. So if the conference is going to post them and you're not super comfortable with people seeing your slides without your talk going with it, ask if you can give them a different version. But you can also post your deck on SlideShare yourself. A lot of attendees want your deck to be able to read along while you're going, or want it ahead of time, and a lot of speakers don't like to give it ahead of time. You do whatever's comfortable for you. A lot of speakers are concerned that if you put your deck up, people will steal it. I have only once ever seen that happen. It's not a huge problem, and I think you get more benefit from sharing your ideas than from hoarding them. And you know, SlideShare is nice because you can upload things as a PDF, as a Keynote, as a PowerPoint, whatever. They'll take almost, I think, any form. And it's then easy to just share the link without your having to host it. But you can use Dropbox too, of course, something like that. I'm trying to think. And then turning it into other media. I mean, it really depends on what is like the content of your talk and the audience who wants to hear it. So I gave a talk recently about addressing bias as a hiring manager or as a conference host or as a VC, as a person who sees a pool of candidates and has to pick a few to give some resources to. And the talk was actually based on a post I'd written for HBR last year. And what was nice is that afterwards people asked me for more information and I could just point them to the post. I'd already written it. And the post was like pretty long and people really wanted that information. They wanted detailed information. I've given many talks where more detailed information would not be welcome, right? Like it's all in the deck, it's all in the talk. People don't need more detail. But some of that depends on, are you giving a 10-minute talk and there's an hour worth of stuff to discuss? Are you giving a 20-minute talk that you had to stretch into? So I think the medium that you follow up in depends a lot on the content and what the talk was like at the beginning and the kinds of info people want afterwards. But I don't think there's one perfect way to go.
Cool. That's very helpful. And yeah, we are slowing down on the questions, but I'll ask for more. The other thing was, do you have, I know you've done a lot of speaker training with people,
Yeah.
especially for Lean Startup. Are there any resources that you've used or created out of that to like help people prepare? Because I know that most conferences don't help their speakers prepare and be amazing.
Right.
So
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. We should have pulled those links up. I wonder if we can find them quickly, because we had
We
two.
can actually put links in the YouTube chat.
Get out.
Yeah.
That is the
So
worst thing I've ever heard. Okay, so we will add the links to the YouTube comments, I
Right.
guess,
To the
afterward.
description,
Yeah,
yeah.
the description, exactly. So yeah, we have, while I'm talking about this, I'm going to say one other thing. If people want to ask questions about what you should wear as a speaker, I'm happy to talk about that. But so yes, we will post in the description of this talk 3 things: the link for the slides and two trainings that we did last year with our speakers at Lean Startup. We did one about how to think about the content of your talk. That was with Sally Cohn, who is has a popular TEDx talk and is a regular on, I think she's now on Fox. She used to be on CNN and speaks a lot. And she gave a great talk about how to think about the content for most impact. And then we did another session where I gave tips on how to think about the physical presence, overcoming nervousness, and then seeming really authoritative. So we've got both of those, and I think they're both in the like 30 to 45 minute range. And we'll post those, and they're free for anybody to watch. Any other questions? Are we getting to the end? I mean, it's almost been an hour, so I think we're...
yeah, I mean, I would love to know your high points on dressing.
Okay, so I'm gonna share those, and I'm just gonna put this back up here. If you wanna reach either of us, I'm putting our contact info back on the screen so you can find the two of us if you have follow-up questions after this. And so in terms of what to wear, always a fun question. Of course, it depends a little bit on the audience. But one of the things I would say is that if you aren't really comfortable in the clothes you're wearing, you are not going to seem comfortable on stage. So sometimes comfortable, it can mean different things. Comfortable can mean your sweatpants, but comfortable could mean you really feel like you bring some presence because you're wearing shoes that you feel like very tall in. You're wearing clothes that just make you feel professional. And the main thing you want to think about is what's going to make you feel good. Typically, since things are now taped, you want to stay away from things with like heavy patterns because that doesn't work in video. Although I wore a striped shirt last year, the strip looked fine. But we had to test it on the camera beforehand. Big jewelry shows up and little jewelry does not. But if you're wearing big earrings or almost any earrings and you get an over-the-head mic, it will hit the mic and usually the AV team will ask you to take off your earrings. So I'm in a constant battle with AV teams over earrings, and I have a set of small earrings that I use for events, and sometimes those don't even work. So that's something to know. Usually your earrings, if you are gonna have a mic that's attached to your head, that's not gonna work. If you're gonna have a lav mic, that is a lavalier mic, and it clips onto your clothes, it needs somewhere pretty firm to clip. So you need lapels that will hold it pretty tightly, and then you have to be aware that you want to be speaking into that, and you can't have a necklace that will hit it. So sometimes knowing ahead of time the AV can help you think about what to wear. And because you are now on screen, you also usually want to think about fabrics that are a little bit reflective. So leather and silk, things that are shiny, look really good on video most of the time.
Great, I love leather.
That's right, you can't go wrong. And things like jersey that kind of absorb light are typically not as crisp on screen.
Okay.
I mean, we can do a whole session on clothes if we want, but those are some things to think about.
But TLDR, shiny.
Yep.
Put a question mark on your patterns. Maybe bring some backup jewelry if you're a jewelry person. Maybe bring a backup jacket or sweater if you're not sure of your mic situation.
That's a great way to think about it. And you want to know, like, get your clothes, try them all on beforehand.
Yeah.
Right. The morning of is not when you want to be figuring out your outfit.
So we did have one last question. Somebody is trying to figure out if they have a bunch of topics they want to talk about, but they're trying to figure out if they're valuable or unique, and they're wondering if there are some good ways to validate that they are actually interesting and unique.
Yeah. So a couple things. First of all, a lot of times just blogging your ideas can help, right? Like you can see, are people responding to, if you blog, write a couple of short posts and figure out which are getting the most play, that's one possibility. You can give versions of your talks to colleagues or friends, or just talk to them about the ideas. Which of these would you most like to learn about? That's not a particularly hard thing to just start asking around to find out what resonates with people. Where do they feel like they would get value out of the ideas that you have? And of course, ask people who are relevant to the audience you would want to reach. This is just like any kind of customer development. You don't want to, if your mother is not the audience for the kind of talk, don't ask her, right? That's true of any product, it's true of your talk. You need to really think about the audience, but presumably in your network, you've got people who you could talk with, and you can be very explicit. I'm thinking about pitching ideas to conferences. Which of these would you find most useful? And you'll probably start to get some pretty consistent threads if you ask a number of people. And that's it's a fun thing to, like, people love to give advice, right? So it's not hard to ask. If you're in a situation where you have a connection to a conference host and they know their audience and they know what the audience would find most interesting and valuable, see if you can get a conversation with them and say you've got a few ideas. And you can usually, in a CFP, you can sometimes apply more than once, but a better thing to do is to go with what you think is your strongest idea and then note somewhere in the application that you have some other ideas or some other angles and you're happy to flesh those out separately.
Yeah.
And then there's also, as I said earlier, if you're doing things like Ignites or small talks in your community, you can try a few and see which really seem to hit.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Huge thanks to Mercedes for making this more fun and way more practically workable. I would have never been able to do this on my own. And thank you all for asking questions and helping us think of this idea in the first place. And we'll send around the various links after we've got this all edited and ready to go.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.